The wind was a predator. It stalked the high plains with a voice of grinding stones, a physical presence that scoured the world clean, leaving only white desolation in its wake. Snow driven horizontally was not a gentle blanket, but a storm of icy needles. It stung Eliza's exposed skin, caked her eyelashes shut, and filled her lungs with a cold so profound it felt like swallowing glass. She fell. The impact was a dull thud against a drift that had already surrendered its form to the gale. Her horse, loyal old Gideon, had gone down an hour ago, a dark shape already being consumed by the storm, his strength finally broken by the unholy cold. Now it was her turn. Crawling was all that was left. Her gloved fingers, numb and clumsy, clawed at the frozen crust of the snow. Each movement was a testament to a will that was rapidly failing. The world had dissolved into a roaring, featureless void of white. Up, down, east, west, all meaning was lost. There was only the cold, the wind, and a fading spark of defiance inside her. Her body screamed for the release of sleep, for the false warmth that she knew was the final siren song of hypothermia. She fought at her mind, latching onto the one anchor she had left. Her fingers fumbled inside her heavy wool coat, seeking the familiar cool weight of the silver locket tucked into an inner pocket. It was her rosary, her prayer book, her compass in a life that had lost its direction. Closing her fist around it, she felt the faint etchings against her palm. Inside were the faces of her ghosts. Thomas, her husband, his gaze so steady and confident. A man who had seemed as immovable as the mountains he'd chosen to build their life against. And Lily, their daughter, her smile a captured piece of sunlight, her laughter a sound that now only echoed in the loneliest chambers of Eliza's memory. The fever had taken them both 2 years prior, a silent, merciless thief that had stolen the warmth and color from her world, leaving her in a perpetual winter of the soul. This blizzard was merely the physical manifestation of the storm she had been living in ever since. She had come west to this plot of land, Thomas's dream determined to honor his legacy, to prove that his strength lived on in her. But the land was indifferent. It demanded a price she was no longer sure she could pay. Thomas? Lily? Her whisper was stolen by the wind, the words freezing on her lips. Her vision blurred, the swirling snow resolving into dancing phantoms. She was so tired. The locket slipped from her numb fingers, falling into the snow. A strangled sob escaped her. It was over. She had failed them. As her consciousness began to fray her body, giving in to the inevitable, a shape loomed in the white chaos. It was tall and broad, a silhouette of impossible substance in the ethereal storm. For a delirious moment, she thought it was Thomas come to guide her home. But this figure was wrapped in heavy furs and carried the lean, patient stillness of a hunter. He moved with a purpose that seemed to defy the tempest itself. Fear, cold and sharp, cut through her lethargy. A raider. An Indian. The stories she'd heard in town, whispers of savages and ghosts of the plains, flooded her mind. He knelt beside her, his face obscured by a fur-lined hood and the swirling snow. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, a stark contrast to her own deathly chill. Panic and a final primal surge of the will to live gave her a sliver of strength. She had one thing left to offer, the only currency a woman alone and dying possessed. Her voice was a ragged, broken thing. "Please, help me." She rasped, the words tearing at her raw throat. She pushed herself up on one elbow, a pathetic gesture of defiance and desperation. "Shelter. I will give you what you want." She offered her body to the Comanche warrior for shelter from the killing blizzard that would claim her life within the hour. It was the ultimate degradation, the final piece of herself she could sacrifice to see another dawn. The figure was silent for a long moment, his presence a dark, unreadable point in the chaos. He reached out not with aggression, but with a slow, deliberate movement, and picked the silver locket from the snow. He brushed the ice from its surface with a gloved thumb before placing it back in her hand, his fingers closing hers around it. Then he looked into her desperate blue eyes, and his voice, when it came, was not the guttural sound of her fears, but a clear, resonant baritone laced with an impossible calm. He spoke in perfect English. "You owe me nothing, white woman." Then he wrapped his buffalo robe around her trembling shoulders. The scent of wood smoke, leather, and pine filled her senses. It was the smell of life. As he lifted her effortlessly from the snow, cradling her like a child, the fight finally went out of her. The world tilted, the roaring wind faded to a distant hum, and she surrendered to the darkness, her last conscious thought, a bewildered echo of his words. "You owe me nothing." It was an act of compassion, so unexpected, so contrary to the harsh laws of this land, that it shattered her understanding of the world she was fighting so hard to survive in. It was the beginning of everything. Warmth returned to her in pieces. First a deep, radiating heat at her back, then a tingling, painful prickling in her fingers and toes as blood, sluggish and cold, began to circulate once more. A heavy weight covered her, a fur of incredible softness that smelled of smoke and wildness. She was lying on a bed of pine boughs and softer hides, the fragrant scent a balm to her raw senses. A fire crackled nearby, its cheerful popping a sound of profound safety. Eliza's eyes fluttered open. She was in a teepee. The conical space was larger than she'd imagined, the stretched hide walls glowing with the warm light of the central fire. The blizzard was a muffled, distant howl outside, its fury held at bay by the sturdy structure. Simple tools, bundles of herbs, and neatly folded pelts were arranged with a spare efficiency around the perimeter. It was a space of order and calm carved from the heart of chaos. Her rescuer sat on the opposite side of the fire, his back to her, tending to a small pot that simmered over the flames. He had shed his heavy outer robe, and she could now see he was dressed in buckskin leggings and a simple tunic. His hair was long and black, tied back with a leather thong. He moved with an economy of motion, a quiet grace that spoke of a deep and patient strength. Her memory of the storm returned in a jarring flash. The desperation, the cold, her shameful offer. A hot flush of humiliation spread across her cheeks. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness washed over her, and her muscles, exhausted and abused by the cold, protested with a collective ache. He heard the rustle of the furs and turned. In the firelight, that his features were stark and striking. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, and dark, intelligent eyes that held no hint of the savagery she had been taught to expect. There was a watchfulness in his gaze, but it was not hostile. It was analytical, observant. He was a man who missed nothing. "Be still," he said, his voice the same calm baritone she remembered. "Your body has been through an ordeal. It needs rest." He rose and ladled some of the steaming contents of the pot into a wooden bowl. He crossed the small space and knelt beside her, offering it. The aroma was rich and savory, a broth of wild game and herbs that made her stomach clench with a hunger she hadn't realized she felt. "Drink this. It will restore your strength." She pushed herself up slowly, her body trembling with the effort. He waited patiently, holding the bowl steady. Her hands were still clumsy, and she accepted it with a nod of thanks, her throat too tight with shame to speak. She sipped the broth. It was hot and life-giving, chasing the last of the deep cold from her bones. They sat in silence as she drank, the only sounds the crackling fire and the mournful cry of the wind outside. When she had drained the bowl, he took it from her. "My name is Cale," he said, breaking the silence. Eliza Vance. You are a long way from the town, Eliza Vance. The storm came fast. My horse," she began, her voice cracking. "Gideon, he is gone." Kyle said, his tone gentle but direct. There was no pity in it, only a statement of fact. In this land, death was not a tragedy to be lamented. It was a constant companion. The snow will have covered him by now. He will feed the wolves and the coyotes. His life will give life to others. It is the way. His simple, unadorned philosophy was strangely comforting. It placed Gideon's death not as a failure, but as part of a great, unceasing cycle. She nodded, clutching the heavy fur around her. Thank you, Kale. For everything. You saved my life. He simply inclined his head, his dark eyes fixed on the dancing flames. Life is a gift. It is not for the storm to take so easily. The silence stretched again, but it was different now. Less awkward, more contemplative. She needed to understand. You're English, she said, the question hanging in the air. It is unexpected. A faint, wry smile touched the corner of his lips. I spent 5 years at a mission school near the Red River. The White Fathers were determined to save my soul by teaching me to read their holy book and forget the tongue of my people. And did they succeed? She asked, genuinely curious. His smile vanished. They taught me that the white man's God promises a paradise in the next life, often while he is busy creating a hell in this one. They taught me his words of compassion, and then I saw his deeds of cruelty. I learned his language, but I did not accept his world. He looked at her, then his gaze direct and piercing. I left the school. I chose to live as a Numanu, as one of the people. But the things a man learns cannot be unlearned. His story silenced her. It spoke of a profound disillusionment of a man caught between two worlds and belonging fully to neither. It explained the quiet wisdom in his eyes, the precision of his speech. He was an outcast by his own choosing, a man who had seen the hypocrisy of her world and turned his back on it. And yet, he had shown her a compassion that she, in her desperation, had not even thought to ask for. I am sorry, she said softly. For what? For what my people have done. For assuming. For what I offered you. The shame returned, hot and sharp. Kyle looked at her, his expression unreadable. You were dying. A person at the mercy of the storm is not who they are. They are only what the cold has made them. Do not be ashamed of your will to live. He stood and added a piece of wood to the fire, sending a shower of sparks up toward the smoke hole at the top of the teepee. Rest now, Eliza Vance. The storm will break by morning. Then I will take you to your home. She lay back down, pulling the furs up to her chin. The blizzard raged on, but inside the small, warm shelter, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She was in the care of a man her people would call a savage, a man who had rejected their ways, yet who had shown her a grace and humanity that humbled her to her core. As sleep finally claimed her, she clutched the silver locket in her hand, but for the first time, the faces inside seemed more distant, their hold on her slightly loosened by the presence of the quiet Comanche warrior who had reminded her that even in the most brutal of winters, kindness could still take root. The world after the storm was one of pristine, blinding beauty. A brilliant sun shone from a sky of the purest blue, and the snow sculpted into fantastic drifts by the wind glittered as if sewn with diamonds. The air was still and cold, so clean it felt sharp in the lungs. Kyle led the way on his sturdy pony with Eliza seated behind him, her hands resting lightly on his shoulders for balance. The buffalo robe was wrapped around her, a cocoon of warmth against the crisp air. They traveled for hours across the transformed landscape, Kyle navigating the deep snow with an unerring instinct. He spoke little, his attention focused on the trail, reading the subtle signs of the land that were invisible to her. Eliza, in turn, was content with the silence. It gave her time to think, to process the chasm that had opened between her life 2 days ago and her life now. The homestead Thomas's legacy had been the singular focus of her existence. Now it felt smaller. Less important than the simple, profound fact of being alive. As the sun reached its zenith, they crested a ridge, and she saw it below them, her small, sturdy cabin, a thread of smoke curling from its stone chimney, the corrals, and the barn half buried in snow. A figure was frantically shoveling a path from the house to the barn. "Jed," she said, a rush of relief and affection welling up inside her. Jedediah was barely a man, only 19, with a shock of unruly blonde hair and a face that hadn't yet decided to take on the hard angles of adulthood. His father had worked for Thomas, and when he'd passed, Jed had stayed on his loyalty to her husband, transferring seamlessly to her. He was earnest, hard-working, and saw the world in simple terms of right and wrong. As they drew closer, Jed looked up, his shovel forgotten. His eyes widened, first in relief at seeing her, then in suspicion as he took in her companion. He dropped the shovel and reached for the rifle that was leaning against the cabin wall. "Mrs. Vance, are you all right?" He called out, his voice tight with alarm. He raised the rifle, aiming it squarely at Cale's chest. "Get away from her, you—" Jed no Eliza slid quickly from the horse's back, stumbling in the deep snow. She put herself directly between Jed's rifle and Cale. "Put the gun down. This man saved my life." Jed's face was a mask of confusion and fear. "But he's a Comanche. His name is Cale Eliza," said her voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "He found me in the blizzard. I would be dead if not for him. Put the rifle down. Now." Reluctantly, Jed lowered the barrel. Though his grip remained tight on the stock, his eyes darting nervously toward Cale, who had remained impassive on his horse, watching the scene with a detached curiosity. He had seen this before. It was the natural order of things. "He's welcome here," Jed Eliza stated, making it a command. "He is our guest." Inside the cabin, the warmth from the pot-bellied stove was a welcome embrace. Eliza bustled about, making coffee and setting out what little food she had. Jed stood awkwardly by the door, a sentinel guarding against a threat only he could see. Kyle accepted a cup of coffee, his dark eyes taking in the small, tidy space, the worn furniture, the handmade quilts, the single bookshelf filled with Thomas's books on engineering and agriculture. He was piecing together the story of the people who lived here. The sound of approaching horses broke the tense quiet. Eliza looked out the window to see a small party of riders making their way up the snow-covered track. At their head was a man who rode with an easy, proprietary air, as if the land already belonged to him. Silas Kane. He was a man who seemed at odds with the rugged landscape. Always impeccably dressed in a tailored coat and clean leather gloves, he exuded an air of refined charm. He was handsome, with a warm smile that never quite reached his cool, calculating eyes. He had arrived in the territory a year ago, buying up vast tracts of land for his cattle operation, his wealth a sudden and powerful force in the community. He had made no secret of his desire to purchase Eliza's homestead, the Triple Creek Ranch, as Thomas had named it, for the 3 streams that watered its northern pasture, the most reliable water source for miles. "Stay inside," Eliza said to Cale, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. She stepped out onto the porch, Jed close behind her. Mrs. Vance Kane called out, his voice booming with practiced bonhomie as he swung down from his horse. "We were about to form a search party. The whole town's been worried sick about you in this storm." He strode onto the porch, removing his hat with a flourish. His gaze was intense, scanning her for any sign of weakness. "I am relieved to see you're unharmed." "I'm fine, Mr. Kane." "I was fortunate," she said, her tone cooler than his. Kane's smile faltered for a fraction of a second as his eyes moved past her to the figure standing just inside the doorway. He saw Cale, and a subtle shift occurred in his demeanor. The polished charm receded, replaced by a glint of something harder, colder. "Well now," he said softly, his voice losing its warmth. "What have we here?" He looked from Cale back to Eliza, a knowing, condescending smirk playing on his lips. "It seems you had company to wait out the storm." The insinuation was clear and ugly. Jed stiffened beside her, his hand inching toward the pistol on his hip. Eliza's chin came up her eyes, flashing with anger. "This man is the reason I am alive, Mr. Kane. He has my gratitude and is a guest in my home." Kane chuckled a low, dismissive sound. "Gratitude is a fine thing, Mrs. Vance, but a woman alone has to be careful of the company she keeps. Some debts are best paid and settled quickly." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "This only proves my point. This is a hard country. It's no place for a lone woman to try and scratch out a living. My offer still stands. A fair price, more than fair. Enough for you to go back east and live comfortably. The ranch is not for sale." Eliza said, her voice like ice. "It was my husband's dream, and it is my home. Dreams don't mend fences or brand cattle." Mrs. Vance Kane said, his smile returning, but it was all teeth now. "Reality does. And the reality is, this land has a way of swallowing those who don't respect its power." His eyes flicked to Cale again. "Or those who don't belong on it." The threat, veiled but unmistakable, hung in the cold air. He was no longer just a persistent buyer. He was a predator, circling, sensing a weakness he could exploit. Cale stepped fully out of the doorway, his presence silent but immense. He did not look at Kane. He looked at the distant mountains as if the petty squabbles of men were beneath his notice. But his stillness was a challenge in itself, a quiet declaration that he would not be intimidated. Kane held Eliza's gaze for a moment longer, then tipped his hat. "You think on it, ma'am. For your own good." He turned and mounted his horse, his men falling in behind him. As they rode away, the churned snow of their tracks seemed to scar the perfect white landscape. Eliza watched them go, a chill running down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The blizzard had been a battle against nature, a simple, honest fight for survival. This, she realized, was something different. This was a battle against the calculated cruelty of men, and it was just beginning. In the weeks that followed, Silas Kane's words proved prophetic. The battle for Triple Creek Ranch began not with an open declaration of war, but with a campaign of slow, grinding attrition. A section of fence along the southern pasture was cut, allowing a dozen head of cattle to wander off into the rough country, where they were lost to gullies or predators. A well that supplied the barn went foul, the waters suddenly brackish and undrinkable, forcing Jed to haul buckets from the creek 200 yards away. Accidents, mishaps, bad luck, each incident was small enough to be plausible on its own. But together, they formed a suffocating pattern of harassment. Eliza refused to be cowed. She worked alongside Jed from sunup to sundown, her hands, once soft, becoming calloused and strong. They rode for days, tracking the lost cattle, recovering only half of them. They spent back-breaking hours digging a new trench to divert cleaner water to the barn. With every act of sabotage, her resolve hardened. This land was all she had left of Thomas and Lily, a tangible link to a life that had been stolen from her. She would not let another thief take this too. Cale had departed the morning after the confrontation with Kane, melting back into the wilderness as silently as he had appeared. But his presence lingered. He had left her with more than just her life. He had left her with a question. His quiet dignity and unexpected compassion stood in stark contrast to Kane's polished menace. It was a dissonance she couldn't ignore, a crack in the simple worldview she had inherited from her husband. One evening, exhausted and discouraged, after finding a new break in their fence line, she found herself sorting through Thomas's old desk. She was looking for a ledger, but her hand fell upon his personal journal. She had never been able to bring herself to read it after his death. The pages felt too sacred, too final. But now, driven by a need to feel his strength, to hear his voice, she opened it. She read about his dreams for the ranch, his love for her, his joy in their daughter. The familiar ache of grief settled in her chest. Then she found an entry from the year before they were married, shortly after he had first claimed this land. It was brief and uncharacteristically troubled. October 14th. The Blackwood incident is concluded. A difficult business, but necessary for the security of this valley. They were desperate, I'll grant them that. But desperation breeds violence. I did what had to be done to protect what is mine. May God have mercy on their souls, for I could not. The name Blackwood meant nothing to her. But the tone was all wrong. It lacked Thomas's usual certainty. There was a shadow of guilt in the words, a hint of something he did not want to examine too closely. An incident. A difficult business. She closed the journal, the passage leaving a strange disquiet in its wake. The next day, she rode into the small, dusty town of Redemption. It was little more than a single street with a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and the sheriff's office. She tied her horse outside the office and went in. Sheriff Brody, a man whose face was a roadmap of weary resignation, looked up from his paperwork. He was a good man, bound by the law, but not blinded by it. He had respected Thomas and had been kind to her after his death. "Mrs. Vance?" he said, a touch of concern in his voice. "Everything all right out at your place?" "I'm having some trouble, Sheriff. Fence has cut a fouled well." Brody sighed, running a hand over his tired face. "I've heard. I paid a visit to Mr. Kane. He swore on a stack of Bibles he and his men had nothing to do with it. Without a witness, there's not much I can do. His word against yours, and he's got a lot of influence in this town already." "I know," she said, frustrated. "That's not why I'm here. I had a different question for you. Do you remember a family by the name of Blackwood?" The sheriff's posture changed. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. He stopped looking at her and started studying the dust motes dancing in the sunbeam from the window. "That's an old name. Haven't heard it in years." "What about them?" "My husband mentioned them in a journal. An incident. It happened about 7 years ago before I came out here." Brody was silent for a long time. He picked up a pen, examined the nib, and set it down again. "Some things are best left in the past, Eliza," he said, his voice low. "Tom Vance was a good man, a pillar of this community. He did what he had to do to stake his claim and make it safe." "What did he have to do, Sheriff?" she pressed. "The official story is that the Blackwood family were squatters on his land," Brody said, finally meeting her gaze. His eyes were troubled. "They turned violent when he asked them to leave, tried to raid his camp. He defended himself. It was ruled self-defense. It was a hard time back then. People were starving." The story aligned with the man she knew, Thomas the Protector. But it didn't align with the guilt in his journal, or the sheriff's reluctance to speak of it. "And Silas Kane?" she asked, changing the subject. "What do you know about him?" "Not much," Brody admitted. "Showed up about a year ago. Said he came into an inheritance back east and wanted to try his hand at ranching. Pays his men well, spends a lot of money at the general store. Most folks are happy to have him here." He paused, a thoughtful frown creasing his brow. "Funny thing, though. For a man with no ranching experience, he's awfully particular about which land he wants. He's been obsessed with your property from the day he arrived." Eliza left the sheriff's office with more questions than answers. The Blackwood incident. An obsession with her land. The two facts felt disconnected, yet she couldn't shake the feeling they were pieces of the same puzzle. A few days later, the puzzle took on a darker shape. Jed was riding the northern pasture when his horse was spooked, throwing him into a rocky creek bed. He limped back to the cabin an hour after dark, his arm hanging at an unnatural angle, his face pale with pain. A neatly cut cinch strap was still clutched in his good hand. It was no accident. As Eliza set his arm, her fear began to curdle into a cold, hard rage. This was no longer about property. Cain was trying to isolate her, to break her spirit, to drive away the only help she had. He was willing to hurt an innocent boy to get what he wanted. That night, as Jed slept fitfully, his arm in a sling, Eliza sat by the fire, Thomas's rifle across her lap. The comforting weight of the weapon did little to soothe her. She felt utterly alone, a single flickering candle against a gathering darkness. The homestead, once a symbol of a cherished dream, now felt like a fortress under siege. A soft sound from the porch made her jump. She raised the rifle, her heart hammering against her ribs. The door creaked open. Cale stood silhouetted in the moonlight. He stepped inside without a word, his eyes immediately finding Jed on the cot. He walked over and examined the boy's injury, his touch surprisingly gentle. Then he looked at the cut cinch strap she had placed on the table. His expression remained unreadable, but a new hardness settled in his eyes. "His work?" Kyle asked. It wasn't a question. Eliza nodded, her throat tight. Cale walked to the window and looked out at the vast, moon-drenched landscape that stretched between her ranch and Cain's. "This is not about cattle," he said, his voice a low rumble. "This is not about water. The man wants more than your land. He wants to see it empty. He wants to see you gone." "I know," she whispered. "But I don't understand why." Cale turned from the window, his gaze locking with hers. It was a gaze that saw past her fear and into the core of her confusion. To understand a man like Cain, you must understand what he has lost. He paused, letting the words sink in. "You asked the sheriff about the Blackwoods. He told you the white man's story. Perhaps you should hear another." And so, in the quiet of the besieged cabin, with the moon casting long shadows across the floor, Cale began to speak. He told her a story not of violent raiders, but of a family of homesteaders, a man named Jonathan Blackwood, his wife, and their 2 sons. They had come west with nothing, their crops having failed back in Missouri. They were starving when they reached this valley. They found the 3 creeks and made a crude camp, believing the land to be unclaimed. They were not squatters, Cale said, his voice even, but laced with an ancient sorrow. They were desperate. They approached your husband's camp not to raid, but to beg for food, for work. Eliza felt a cold dread creep up her spine. What happened? Your husband saw them as a threat to his claim. He told them to leave. Jonathan Blackwood pleaded for his family. He had a wife and 2 boys. One was a young man, and the other just a child. Cale's eyes were distant, as if he were seeing the events unfold again in the shadows of the room. An argument started. Your husband believed they were reaching for weapons. He fired his rifle. Cale fell silent. The crackling of the fire was unnaturally loud in the small cabin. He killed them. Eliza asked, her voice barely a whisper. The words felt like poison in her mouth. He killed Jonathan. He killed the older son. The wife, she ran screaming. He shot her in the back. Eliza's world tilted on its axis. The image of Thomas, her steady, honorable Thomas, gunning down a pleading woman, shattered into a million pieces. No, she breathed. No, he wouldn't. He wasn't a murderer. He was a man protecting what he believed was his. Kyle said, his tone devoid of judgment. He saw a threat and he eliminated it. The law called it self-defense. The land called it a massacre. A chilling realization began to dawn, so monstrous she could hardly dare to form the thought. "And the other son?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The child." Kyle met her eyes, and in their dark depths she saw the terrible, inevitable truth. "The younger boy escaped," Cale said softly. "He hid in the rocks and watched it all. He watched his family die. He was about 12 years old. His name was Silas." The room fell away. Silas Cain. Some debts are paid in land, others in blood. His obsession, his veiled threats. It all clicked into place with the sickening finality of a tomb door swinging shut. He wasn't Silas Kane, the cattle baron. He was Silas Blackwood, the orphaned boy returned as an angel of vengeance. He didn't want to buy her land. He wanted to reclaim his family's grave. He wanted to strip from her the last thing she had, just as Thomas had stripped everything from him. The homestead was not a prize. It was a weapon, and it was aimed directly at her heart. The revelation left Eliza hollowed out, as if the entire foundation of her life had been replaced with dust. The man she had loved, and the man whose memory she had built her world around, was not the hero of her story. He was the villain in someone else's. The grief she felt was new and complicated, a mourning not just for the husband she had lost, but for the man she had never truly known. Every act of defiance she had taken to protect his legacy now felt like a defense of a terrible crime. Her anger at Kane was now entangled with a profound, sickening pity. She saw not a monster, but a boy frozen in time, still hiding in the rocks, his entire life warped around a single, horrific moment of violence. But pity could not erase the immediate danger. His campaign of harassment was not just a business tactic. It was a deeply personal crusade. He would not stop. He would only escalate. "What do I do?" she asked Cale, her voice raw. The rifle on her lap suddenly felt heavy with the weight of its history. "Truth is a weapon," Kyle said. "But it cuts both ways. You can run from it and let him win, or you can face it and choose a different path." A new resolve began to form amidst the ruins of her old beliefs. She would not run. She would not be a victim of her husband's legacy or Kane's revenge. "I need proof," she said, her voice gaining strength. "The sheriff won't believe the word of a Comanche against the official record. I need something more. Need something." Kyle nodded. "The boy Silas, he ran north after it happened toward the broken mesa. My people found him half dead from fear and grief. He stayed with us for a moon before a patrol from the fort took him away to be sent to an orphanage in the east." He looked at her pointedly. "There will be a record at the fort." It was a long shot, a fragile hope, but it was all she had. The next morning, leaving Jed with strict instructions to stay inside and rest his arm, Eliza rode for Fort Bridger, a 2-day journey. Kyle went with her. He didn't ask. He simply appeared on his pony at the edge of her property as the sun was rising, a silent, steady presence. They rode mostly in silence, the vast open country, a backdrop for the turmoil in her mind. At the fort, Eliza's inquiries were met with bureaucratic indifference. Records from 7 years ago were disorganized, stored in dusty, forgotten archives. But her quiet persistence, a polite refusal to be turned away, finally wore down a weary clerk. After hours of searching, he produced a faded ledger. And there it was, an entry detailing the discovery of a traumatized boy, Silas Blackwood, found by Comanche hunters. It named him as the sole survivor of the Blackwood incident, and noted he was being transported to the St. Jude's Home for Boys in St. Louis. The clerk, seeing the name, remembered something else. Blackwood. Say that's the name of the family that fellow Kane was asking about last year when he first arrived. Said he was a genealogist tracing family lines. Seemed mighty interested in what happened to them. The pieces were locking into place. Kane had come back not just with a fortune, but with a plan, carefully laying the groundwork for his revenge. The ride back to the ranch was fraught with a new urgency. Armed with the ledger entry, she had a chance to convince Sheriff Brody to make him see that this was not a simple land dispute. But as they neared the valley, a pillar of dark smoke rising against the blue sky sent a spear of ice through Eliza's heart. They spurred their horses, racing toward the ranch. The smoke was coming from her northern pasture. They arrived to find a scene of devastation. The small line cabin Thomas had built near the creeks, used for shelter during roundups, had been burned to the ground. It was still smoldering, the air thick with the smell of scorched pine. But worse was the sight of her cattle, a dozen of them lying dead or dying near the creek shot and left to rot. It was a message of pure, wasteful cruelty. Cain was no longer just applying pressure. He was scorching the earth. This was an act of annihilation. As Eliza stood staring in horror at the carnage, Kyle knelt examining the tracks around the burned cabin. 3 riders, he said, his voice grim. And they drove a few of your branded cattle away with them toward Cain's property. The trap snapped shut in her mind. It was sickeningly brilliant. He hadn't just destroyed her property. He had manufactured evidence. He's framing me, she said, the words tasting like ash. Or you. He'll say we rustled his cattle in retaliation. As if on cue, a rider appeared on the ridge above them. It was one of Cain's men. He saw the dead cattle, and immediately wheeled his horse around, galloping back the way he came. He's going for the sheriff, Eliza said, her mind racing. They'll come here, find this. They'll find Cale with me. A Comanche at the scene of a crime. No one will listen to us. We cannot outrun the sheriff's posse, Kyle said calmly, though his eyes were hard as flint. And we cannot run from the truth. The stand must be made here, at your home. They rode back to the main cabin in a grim silence. The beautiful, sprawling landscape that had once seemed full of promise now felt like the closing walls of a prison. They found Jed on the porch, his good hand clutching a shotgun, his young face pale but determined. He had seen the smoke and knew trouble was coming. Mrs. Vance, what's happening? Get inside, Jed, she said, her voice tight with a control she did not feel, and bar the door. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, a new storm began to gather on the horizon. The wind picked up, rattling the window panes, a low moan that seemed to echo the dread in Eliza's heart. The approaching weather was a fitting backdrop for the confrontation to come a mirror of the blizzard that had started it all. Eliza lit the lanterns inside the cabin, the warm glow pushing back against the encroaching shadows. She loaded Thomas's rifle, the familiar clicks of the mechanism, a small, solid sound in the tense quiet. Kyle stood by the window, a sentinel watching the long track that led to their door. They will come soon, he said. Cain will come first, Eliza predicted. He'll want to be here to see it. He'll want to force me to sign the deed before the sheriff arrives. She was right. Not 20 minutes later, 3 riders emerged from the gloaming. Silas, Cain, and 2 of his most brutal-looking ranch hands. They dismounted, their spurs jingling with a sound of finality, and strode onto the porch. Cain's charming facade was gone. His face, illuminated by the lantern light spilling from the window, was a mask of cold fury and triumphant hatred. He held a piece of paper in his hand, the deed to her land. Eliza, he said, his voice dangerously soft, as he pushed the door open. His men flanked him, their hands resting on their holstered pistols. This has gone on long enough. You will sign the deed, or my men will burn this cabin to the ground, with you and your savage friend inside it. The sheriff will arrive soon to arrest you for cattle rustling. By the time he gets here, this will all be over. He'll find a tragic accident. A desperate woman who took the coward's way out. The moment was here. The culmination of 7 years of pain and planning for him, and a lifetime of unraveling for her. Eliza stood her ground in the center of the room, the rifle held loosely at her side. Cale moved from the window to stand beside her, his presence a silent, unshakable pillar of support. My name is Eliza Vance, she said, her voice clear and steady, betraying none of the fear that churned within her. But you are not Silas Cain, are you? She took a step forward, her eyes locking onto his. Your name is Silas Blackwood. The name struck him like a physical blow. For a split second, the mask slipped, and she saw him not the powerful cattle baron, but the terrified 12-year-old boy, his face contorted in a mask of shock and ancient grief. The air in the cabin grew thick and heavy, charged with the weight of a name spoken aloud for the first time in years. Silas's composure fractured. The carefully constructed persona of the charming land baron dissolved, revealing the raw, festering wound beneath. His men shifted uncomfortably, sensing a sudden change in the script they had been given. "How do you know that name?" He hissed, his voice, losing its smooth control and taking on a ragged edge. "Because I know what happened to your family." Eliza said, her own voice trembling slightly, not with fear, but with the enormity of the tragedy that connected them. "I know what my husband did. At the 3 Creeks. To your father, your mother, your brother." Silas let out a harsh, broken laugh. "What your husband did? He slaughtered them. He murdered them in cold blood while they begged for food. He was a butcher, and you live in his house on his stolen land, content in your ignorance." "I am not ignorant anymore." She countered, her gaze unwavering. "But your revenge stops here. This land is soaked in enough blood. There will be no more." From the distance, a faint sound carried on the rising wind, the rhythmic drumming of approaching horses. The posse. The sound was a ticking clock, adding a desperate urgency to the standoff. "It's over, Blackwood," she said, using his true name like a blade. "The sheriff is coming. You can't hide what you are any longer. He's coming to arrest you." Silas spat, regaining a sliver of his bravado. He shoved the deed at her. Sign it, and I might tell the sheriff it was all a misunderstanding. A last chance, Eliza. Give me back what is mine." "It was never yours," a calm voice stated from beside Eliza. Cale stepped forward slightly, drawing Silas's venomous glare. "The land belongs to no man. It only suffers our presence." "You," Silas snarled, his hatred now fully directed at Cale, the Comanche who watched and did nothing. "I remember you. You were a boy hiding in the trees. You saw it all, and you let it happen." Cale's stoic expression finally cracked, replaced by a deep, profound sorrow. "I was a child as you were. I was frozen by fear, a fear I have lived with every day since. But my memory of that day is clear." He turned his head, not looking at Silas, but at Eliza, his words intended for her alone. "Your husband fired first, Eliza Vance. He fired on a man whose only weapon was a plea to feed his family. It was the final devastating confirmation. The last shred of doubt and the last vestige of the heroic image of Thomas she had clung to evaporated in the face of Cale's testimony. It was the truth, stark and terrible. The sound of the posse was much closer now, the jingle of harnesses and the snorting of horses clearly audible over the wind. The windows rattled in their frames as the storm broke, a sudden downpour lashing against the cabin. Time was up. Realization dawned on Silas's face. He was trapped. His carefully laid plan was unraveling. In a final desperate act of madness, his hand shot to the pistol at his hip. "If I can't have the land," he screamed, his face a mask of rage and grief, "no one will." He didn't aim for Eliza or Cale. He aimed for the lantern hanging from the central beam, intending to plunge the room into chaos and fire. But Cale moved with the blurring speed of a striking snake. He didn't draw a weapon. He crossed the space in 2 bounds, and his hand shot out not to disarm Silas, but to grab his wrist, turning the gun's trajectory toward the ceiling. The shot exploded with a deafening roar, blowing a hole in the roof and sending splinters showering down. At the same instant, the cabin door burst open. Sheriff Brody stood there, flanked by his deputies, his own pistol drawn. "Drop it, Kane," he yelled. The scene was a frozen tableau. Silas and Cale locked together, Eliza standing with the rifle Jed cowering by the fireplace, and the law framed in the doorway against a backdrop of flashing lightning and driving rain. Silas, his eyes wild, tried to wrestle the gun free. "She's the criminal sheriff. Her and the savage they've been rustling my stock." "I don't think so." Brody set his gaze hard. He was looking at the deed clutched in Silas's other hand. "I got a telegraph from Fort Bridger an hour ago. A clerk remembered your genealogical inquiries. It seems you've been lying about who you are since the day you set foot in this valley, Mr. Blackwood. Silas froze. It was over. The lie that had sustained him, the identity that had been his armor, was gone. His whole body seemed to collapse inward. The fight drained out of him, leaving only the hollow shell of a broken man. He released the pistol which Cale took from his grasp. Silas sank to his knees, his shoulders shaking with dry, silent sobs. The posse moved in the tense standoff, dissolving into the quiet, somber business of arrest. As the deputies led Silas away, he looked up at Eliza, his eyes no longer filled with hate, but with a vast, empty despair. "He took everything from me," he whispered. "Everything." Eliza looked back at him, and she felt no triumph, only a deep, aching sorrow for the boy he had been and the man his grief had turned him into. "I know," she said softly. And she did. Sheriff Brody holstered his pistol, his weary eyes moving from the weeping man, being led out into the rain, to Cale, who stood silently by the hearth. He walked over to Cale, his expression one of a man reevaluating a lifetime of assumptions. "The charges of rustling are dropped," Brody said, his voice gruff with unspoken emotion. "My deputy found the cut cinch strap back at the cabin." "And your cattle, Mrs. Vance?" "They were found in a hidden box canyon on Kane's property. Looks like he was the rustler all along." He offered a hand to Kyle. "It seems this town owes you an apology, and a debt of thanks." Kyle looked at the outstretched hand for a long moment, before shaking it, a brief firm gesture of acknowledgement. Justice in the white man's world had finally improbably arrived. The storm passed as quickly as it had come. The deputies left with their prisoner, and the posse dispersed, leaving the three of them, Eliza, Kyle, and Jed, in the quiet rain-washed aftermath. The cabin was a mess of shattered wood and tracked-in mud, a hole in its roof, a stark reminder of the violence that had erupted within its walls. But the air, for the first time in months, was clear. Eliza stood on the porch, watching the last of the storm clouds retreat across the plains. The land was washed clean, glistening under the emerging stars. It was still hers. She had won. But the victory felt empty, the prize tainted by the blood that had been spilled to claim it, and the vengeance that had been sought to reclaim it. It was a legacy of violence, a cycle she now had the power to break. She turned to Cale, who was watching her, his expression thoughtful. "This was never my husband's land to take," she said. "And it's not my land to keep. Not all of it." The next day, Eliza rode into Redemption. She went not to the sheriff's office, but to the land registry. In a public act that stunned the townspeople who had gathered to watch, she signed a new deed. She formally ceded the entire northern pasture, the land watered by the 3 creeks, the most valuable part of the ranch and the very ground the Blackwood family had died for, to Cale's people, the Pennateca band of the Comanche, as a gesture of peace and reconciliation. She was not giving it back. She was acknowledging it had never truly been hers. She turned the homestead itself, the cabin and the barn, into something new. It would no longer be the Triple Creek Ranch. It would be the Triple Creek Trading Post, a neutral ground, where settlers and Native Americans could trade in peace, a small point of light in a territory still rife with mistrust and hatred. Jed, his initial suspicions long since melted away eagerly, agreed to help her run it. A week later, Eliza walked to the small, lonely hill, where 2 graves lay marked by simple wooden crosses. Thomas, Lily. The sun was setting, casting a long golden light over the valley. She pulled the silver locket from her pocket and opened it one last time, her thumb tracing the familiar beloved faces. She looked at the portrait of her husband, the strong, confident man she had adored. She saw him now, not as a hero or a villain, but as a man flawed and fallible, who had made a terrible choice out of fear and pride. She could finally see him whole. With a quiet prayer of farewell, she closed the locket. She knelt and dug a small hole in the earth at the foot of his headstone. She placed the silver heirloom inside and covered it with dirt, burying the ghosts of her past in the very land they had fought and died for. This act was her true declaration of ownership, not of the land, but of her own future. She was no longer defined by her grief or by Thomas's legacy. She had accepted the painful truth and was choosing to build a new life, one based not on a dream of the past, but on the hard-won hope for a better future. She stood and walked away from the graves, her back straight, her stride steady. She did not look back. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the first stars began to appear in the vast darkening sky over a changed and healing land.